So at the same time as those personal stories making personal changes and public stories making progressive, sometimes public changes, there's also another level, the level at which we are governed socially by technologies of individual subject regulation and representation. The kind of form of governance that Foucault and Nicholas Rose described, for instance. So what happens then with these personal stories that maybe have social effects? What about stories that move between the two fields? That can happen, for instance, when personal stories are told between people in a kind of micro-social effect. Or it can happen when somebody tells something more broadly that brings up a kind of a group effect. A good example here would be the way that people have told stories about long COVID, the effects of long COVID, and have built up activist groups really around long COVID. All this can happen internationally with kind of personal stories that have very broad effects. And a good example would be the picture, which was itself a story, and then the verbal story around it of the 3-year-old child, Aylan Kurdi, who was the Syrian child who was drowned and found on a Turkish beach. And that's a story credited with changing many people's understandings of the so-called refugee crisis in 2015. So these kind of psychosocially crisscrossing narrative relations and effects are what I want to think about today. Just here, there's a screenshot of one long COVID support group. There are many thousands of these. And that's the kind of public page of it. It says, setting up this group to share our stories, make a place where you can get advice and support. That's how the stories are characterized here as kind of the starting point for the advice and support. Okay, so actually social change is not only progressive. We tend to be often thinking about social changes, the parts that we're interested in as progressive, but there's a lot of retrogressive social change. And actually narrative researchers do work on those areas too. They're working therefore on narratives that operate against social justice. They may be narratives saturated with xenophobia, racism, nationalism, anti-democracy. My colleague at Bristol, Roger Burrows, describes these stories in great detail. I put a little picture here of these kinds of neo-reactionary stories that are very current in US online discourse. So interestingly, despite these being very reactionary stories, they can contain individual pathway stories of suffering and struggle and transcendence of exactly the same kind that we might think of as happening within progressive social change stories. So they can contain stories of overcoming trauma, dealing with difficulty, realizing who you are, and all that stuff within an entirely anti-democratic and reactionary narrative. So, there's quite a lot of work on this. It's perhaps not the most popular area to work on, but perhaps it's something we ought to think about working on more as narrative scholars. And then there's also the kind of change that looks like no change, narratives of conservatism, really. So these are narratives that claim to act against change, to operate only conservatively, to maintain things as they are. But even conservative narratives do, of course, involve change, because narratives always exist within contested spaces of power relations. So there's a struggle. Even to keep things the same, there's a struggle. So the same that is kept is never quite the same. So a good example, I think, is the UK government's stories about COVID, which have changed quite a lot over time. And these stories are, of course, directed at maintaining the government in power, which is a right-wing government. And that government, as most right-wing governments do, predominantly serves the corporate interests, global corporate interests increasingly, but it also needs to be elected by everybody, or a large proportion of the population needs to be elected by all classes. So during COVID, that need entailed keeping people alive and the health service operation. So government communication at this time took the form, the most dominant communication took the form of this imperative future narrative, the one on the left: stay home, protect the NHS, save lives. So the NHS is the National Health Service. And this was a narrative of what we individually and collectively must do in order to stay healthy and alive. And actually, most people, I think, bought into this narrative. They adopted this narrative, they followed this narrative in action, and they told this narrative to each other. It was a powerful social story. Okay. Later, as COVID prevalence reduced, this is in like mid 2020, the UK government adopted this second kind of slogan narrative on the right here, stay alert, control the virus, save lives. So this is a story of a time of opening up the economy, mitigating, providing some mitigating measures around COVID to keep people alive. But this was actually a very unsuccessful narrative in terms of how it was adopted by people in the UK. It's not a very clear story. You have to stay alert. That's going to help you control the virus and control it. You're going to control the virus, not doctors or public health or anything. You personally will be controlling the virus, and that's going to save lives. It's a difficult story to follow. And it was often parodied, and there were kind of memes of what the story really meant. It was not seen as a story that bound people together, but really one that divided people, that divided the government from the people, in fact. So the usual caricature of what this story really meant was something like, stay vague, because this is a very vague story, make money for us, that is the government sending people back to work, and kill your granny. That was the kind of general parody of what this story meant. So currently, the government's narrated imperative is a bit more publicly acceptable, I think. The narrated public communication is to maintain an open economy and profitability by naturalizing a return to normal, but that is something of a different normal. So this is the conservatism that isn't the same. It's a normal that involves an un-COVID mitigated society, accompanied by neo-colonial vaccine regimes and high prevalence endemicity, with accompanying quite high levels of morbidity and mortality. So we're back to normal, but people are dying and getting quite ill. Let me just show you the health minister's recent pictorial representation of this. This is Sajid Javid on Twitter just last week. Easing COVID restrictions on adult social care, so normalizing and opening up for people who are in fact at most risk, people for whom vaccines work least well, and people who are then going to be very likely repeatedly exposed to Omicron infection, which can repeat within a cycle of a few weeks. So, you know, this is a kind of odd normal, but definitely the narrative is a conservative narrative, even though the return to normal is a different normal. So across these stories, things are said to be returning to normal for everyone, but in this new normal, UK wealthy people, as throughout the world, have made a lot more money during COVID. And the place of the less powerful is considerably more disenfranchised, poorer and iller than before. And there is some evidence that these stories have not been that effective in establishing a newly disenfranchising normal for people. However, that was more true at first. At the beginning, most of the population acted really quite differently to that second story, the stay alert, control the virus, save lives story. They actually stayed with the first story, stay home, protect the NHS and save lives. They didn't go out, they didn't spend money, not to the degree that was required of them, really, anyway. However, now, there are signs that people are being more affected by these conservatizing stories of what normal is. They are indeed taking on the idea that this new normal is going to involve exacerbated and new social divisions, for instance. So I'm not going to talk more about these kinds of performative narratives of conservatism, although you can see there's quite a lot of room to work on them. If you were to think about it, I think that would be great. But I'm going to talk rather about progressive social change narratives that aim at social justice, democratization, and other progressive changes. And I'm going to do that for a few different reasons. First of all, that I think most narrative researchers are most interested in this kind of story. And second, because at a time of widening socioeconomic inequalities and global climate emergency and increasing health precarity, it's quite important to recognize that there are stories that are making progressive change. And these stories are often working in the same space as progressive social movements, like most recently, for instance, Black Lives Matter, refugee and migration rights movements, youth climate change movements, Me Too. So they're working in those spaces somewhat effectively. The resurgences of anti-democratic public stories, like those promoted by the online neo-reactionaries I mentioned before, don't erase the impact of these progressive stories and what people are doing to take the story in new directions. I think the third reason to think about progressive personal stories and their kind of social effects, their social change effects, is that personal stories have long histories of involvement in social justice struggles. They've been key elements in social movements against slavery, for civil rights, for women's emancipation, against gay rights, and against colonialism. Quite a lot of noise. I'm just wondering, is that okay? That looks good. So there's this long history of personal storytelling kind of having quite a key role in social movements and organizations. It's true also in traditions related to independence and post-conflict struggles, to testimonia in South and Central America. And I've actually just put some pictures here of books that kind of exemplify this. Let me just go back, sorry. Yeah, in particular, a book that Olivia and colleagues will know, Let Me Speak by Domitila Chingara, and then I, Rigoberta Menchú, and then two books from South Africa, well, one from South Africa, one from more written in Botswana, I think, Percy Headsman, Brent Birds Gather, and then Steve Biko's collected text, I Write What I Like. So in these books, the first person stands in for a larger collectivity. Personal narratives enable a trajectory from stories of me to stories of us. Okay, and a fourth reason why I think it's quite important to look at these narratives now is that it's perhaps particularly important to do so at times when larger shifts are not seeming to go in a progressive direction. So in a time of moves towards white populism and nationalism, these are, these stories and their effects are things we might want to pay attention to. So I want to look at a couple of accounts from outside of social sciences, actually, of how progressive social change narratives work. So these are not conventional theories of change accounts or theories of social change, or indeed theories of how things change in narratives. And nor are they accounts really that give a full kind of recipe for social change. But each of them suggests one apparently quite simple thing that we can think about and look for in analysing and understanding narratives and social change. And so these are the two accounts that I suggested you read or look at. One is Chimamanda Adichie's TED Talk from 2009, The Danger of the Single Story, and the other is Homi Bhabha's short piece called The Right to Narrate. So it's possible to make much larger typologies and to examine all this in quite a lot more detail. I was very privileged to edit recently a book called Stories Changing Lives. Some of the presenters here have contributed to that book. I'm actually not going to talk about their contributions, but just a couple of times I'm going to talk about contributions of other writers to in the book who are not with us, just so you get an idea of some other things that are in it. But anyway, I want to start out first with these two accounts, the Adichie and the Bhabha accounts. So Chimamanda Adichie's talk has been very widely seen and I think pretty often discussed. She says in it, stories matter, many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. So she suggests that a single story is dangerous because it's rigid. It shuts people out, it denies rather than recognizing commonalities as well as differences. Multiple stories can have the kind of effects that she talks about above, repairing broken dignity, empowering and humanizing. For her, more stories, which means not just different content, but stories from different people speaking from different places, will make a positive change. Of course, one story may just contradict another or make sense only within a broader story. So for instance, a stereotyped story like the ones that Adichie talks about, of what it is to be poor or to be Mexican, or the minority world's dominant single African story of catastrophe and underdevelopment. So these examples she uses, they only really make sense if you add them to other stories as kind of cover stories for those other stories. For instance, as kind of cover stories for stories of colonialism and neocolonialism, or in the case of the African story, for the story that Walter Rodney told of how Europe underdeveloped Africa. So in fact, and in contrast to some interpretations of narrative researchers always involving just different understandings and different truths, stereotype stories, however much their narratives believe in them, are wrong. At best, they are right only as indicators of particular conscious or unconscious attitudes serving specific interests. But even a more truthful story, or multiple stories of the kind that Adichie's talking about, won't get everything right. Adichie emphasizes a kind of empirical multiplicity rather than full truth. It's unlikely that we can ever tell a full psychological or social truth, but the multiple narratives that she talks about move towards that maybe. They certainly don't move towards relativism. So when Adichie describes the dangers of a single story and posits that listening to and seeking out more stories is valuable and makes for positive social change, it seems, I think, that she is indicating that multiple stories build or approach truth. She wants to engage with, she says, all of the stories about a person or a place. Narratives in this account are knowledge and learning, and not just telling. Actually, the etymology of the word narrative also comes from a word that means to know or to get to know, to learn. So stories and knowledge accrete and evolve together in Adichie's account. They can also let a reader or another audience recognize and value themselves and others, as Adichie points out. At the same time, the single stories against which these multiple stories are positive. The single stories against which these multiple stories work are serving functions themselves to maintain certain kinds of power. As Adichie points out, people fight to keep that, the power of those single stories. And the power of those single stories, of course, resides not just in what's in them, but in who's telling them and for what purpose and so on, in the positionality of those single stories. When we depart from a single story, what changes is not just knowledge, but the situatedness of that knowledge. When we make and listen to many stories rather than just one, we are also contesting what Gayatri Spivak calls epistemic violence, in this case, the violence of the single story. So then how in this account does change happen? Adichie suggests that single stories are rigidly held onto, and that makes them stereotypes, attitudes characterized by rigidity of thinking. And interestingly, Homi Bhabha argues in another piece that I didn't suggest you read, that a stereotype's rigidity is, like many rigidities, actually quite fragile. It's asserted and maintained against the diverse and disconfirming knowledge and stories all around it. In that account, stories' social change potential is kind of built in. They make knowledge in response to the world, and then attempts to constrain those developing knowledges and stories into structures that set up rigid imaginary worlds are bound to fail, really. Nevertheless, these single stereotyping stories are shored up by powerful interests. And counteracting stories, which might be for Adichie actually just more stories. They don't even have to actually counter what's in dominant narratives. Counteracting stories, not just saying therefore different countering things, but counteracting epistemic hegemony, are really what make the failure of the rigid stereotypical single story happen. So narrative research is also interested, I think, in many of the processes of multiplying these single stories towards change. For instance, Clarissa Bunzaya, who's a colleague, I guess, of many of the South African colleagues here, has written in many different papers, actually, about how an intersectional and decolonial tracing of the different shapes of narratives can generate an expanded understanding of, for instance, the intersections of racialization, gender, sex work, and gender-based violence. So such expanded knowledge in the accounts that she gives is both change in itself and the basis for other change. Another example would be from the Stories Changing Lives book, the account that Shese Kessie gives of her research with in a photo voice project that opened up a space for Black women and non-binary South Africans, students, I think, all students, yeah, to narrate their places on a historically white campus through visual and verbal stories, which had partly been occluded before, really. but partly being told newly by these storytellers. So it's partly a matter of the stories having previously been silenced, I guess, and then also partly these stories just being found and told now. So the storytellers in this research exhibited the work as well, the pictures. This is one of the pictures. They talked about it and they engaged critically with the institution around this project. The pictures, though, don't look much to do with social change. In fact, none of them look directly empowering in that kind of way that we might expect. This is a really shadowy campus landscape with some lights within it. There's one of them is the narrative's residence. And even that slightly safer private space doesn't actually look, it's not narrated in this image as a welcoming place, I don't think. So the registering of many stories, as in this kind of work, doesn't necessarily make a large progressive shift. There may be a small qualified shift. The work may register exclusion rather than erasing it. The work may make moves towards making another space rather than claiming wholesale a new space. So I think this kind of multiplication of stories as a process towards social change can involve a number of other processes too. For instance, also in this book, Michael Murray describes, just as an example, two women's memoirs of working as activists in Scotland in the mid-20th century. They're working in rather similar contexts. They're doing quite a lot of similar work. Murray's suggestion is that people reading these memoirs read and learn from them and act. You know, they take those narratives into their own lives and work with them. But at the same time, it's important to note that these are quite different narratives. So there's room for quite a lot of them. And that different people are going to audience these narratives differently and approach them in different ways. And in a kind of reverse move, Kenneth Plummer has argued very often, actually, over a period of many years, that multiple stories that gather people together because of their commonalities, as Avicii talks about, multiple stories that gather people together can then, through those commonalities, precipitate action. So they work through multiplicity, although in a kind of coalitional way, they then work for a common purpose. And you know, this is true in Plummer's account in terms of consciousness raising groups, gay and lesbian activism, HIV support groups would be another example. I think, again, a quite interesting and important recent example would be long COVID. And this is Nisreen Alwan describing how she thinks that long COVID has become an institutional and a popular discourse through the testimony, really, of people living with long COVID. As she says here, long COVID is likely the first illness in history that has been defined by patients through social media platforms, such as Twitter and Facebook. People with long COVID formed a movement that demanded recognition of what was happening to them. During the first wave of the pandemic in 2020, online testimonials of prolonged symptoms following SARS-CoV-2 infection were the only source of reassurance to others with a similar experience, including the author. Previously healthy and active people described persistent symptoms. By summer 2020, thousands were joining social media support groups. A narrative emerged of people struggling to make sense of their symptoms and forming their own groups to understand and research what was happening to them in an international citizen science movement. That's a narratively driven movement, really, which would be really interesting to research in some more detail, I think. So, I think what would be interesting at this point is for us to spend a bit of time talking together about at least some of what Adichie is saying. I'm going to move to a more, maybe a slightly more controversial quote from her talk, which is this one. When we reject the single story, she says, when we realize that there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise. So that's a quite strong claim to make. But I also think that her more general account is an interesting one, the account that suggests that simply moving beyond the single story is something that has a quite progressive impact. So what I'd like us to do is just think about that, in particular that quote quote that I showed you, which I now can't show you because I'm going to put you into breakout rooms. But what it says is, let me just read it again. When we reject the single story, when we realize that there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise. So what I'd like us to do is just spend some time in groups. There are 32 of us here. I'm going to split us up into like just small groups of 3 maybe. So I'll split us up into small groups. We could spend like 5 minutes discussing this and then come back. Good to have some feedback from you on this. Just before we do that, any questions about what's happened so far, what I've been talking about so far? Looks like no questions.
Corinne, I just want to say I just put the quote in the chat.
Thank you so much, Molly. Yeah, so the quote is in the screenshot there. That's lovely. Thank you. Okay, so let's have some time in the breakout rooms, maybe just 5 minutes or something. I'm going to set those up now. See you in a few minutes. Thanks. Here we go. Haley and Tamara and Kalidas. Are you guys here?
Hello, Corinne.
Hi, how are you?
I go to the room, but
Yeah.
I am alone in the room.
Oh, you know what? I think that happened because the first person was there on their own.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I moved them. So I'm sorry. So, but you're here with me.
Yes, it's okay.
Okay, well, we can talk about it. I mean, did you read that or did you watch that piece, that talk by Chimamanda Adichie?
I see the video. My English is very basic, so I'm sorry. I like a lot the video, the TED video, and I think about my research. It is about in the master about the second generation, the son and daughter of militants, political militants, the left party in Argentina and Chile.
Yeah.
And I interest in see them not only like victims.
Yeah. Okay.
They are see usually that like victims. I want to recognize your agency.
Right.
In this process.
And is that happening? Is that happening in your research?
Yes.
Right.
But it is a process. Que ocurría that occur.
Yeah.
Yes. In the exercise of narration.
Mm-hmm.
When they tell me about their history, we take conscience.
Yeah.
About
recall. So this is a piece that actually follows up on some stuff that Baba wrote earlier in The Location of Culture. And he says, let me just share screen. The right to narrate is not simply a linguistic act, it's also a metaphor for the fundamental human interest in freedom itself, the right to be heard, to be recognized and represented. For Baba, the right to narrate, which he talks about in this piece, is not something that has to be fully articulated or even verbal. He says, I think this is quite interesting, it could be there in a brushstroke or a dance gesture or a camera angle. And I think, although he doesn't say this, it's not actually an absolute right. It's never complete or perfect or anything like this. I mean, if you look at his other work on representation, that's pretty much implied. But certainly it can happen across media in just moments as well as in fully developed narratives. And he says that this right to narrate, a kind of dialogic representation act, is necessary for subjects but not sufficient. It's essential for sociality, and it has to be protected. And it might not seem very much, it's just a right to make a gesture, take a certain camera angle, glance in a certain way. But I think it's something that does appear quite strongly as important in people's narratives in difficult circumstances. And I'm thinking particularly of work that I've done recently with colleagues in Brazil, in South Africa, in Zambia, with people who are living with HIV and COVID, in which there's quite often a very persistent and consistent registration of what has been lost. People with HIV are obviously, not obviously, but in many cases are structurally disadvantaged in many ways, and COVID has intensified those disadvantages. And people talking about this, people with HIV are, after all, pandemic experts, mark very clearly what has been lost and whether it can be regained or not. They mark it, they don't necessarily say we're going to get this back, but they keep marking these losses of rights. And that reminds me a lot of the accounts that Sabra Ahmed gives of complaint and the importance of being an awkward subject, saying things that are not wanting to be heard, saying things all the time about what's been lost or taken away or denied, repeatedly in that way reclaiming entitlement. So Baba doesn't really talk about it being quite as assertive as that, but I think it certainly can be, this right to narrate. He does say also that he thinks these losses cannot be fully repaired. And he talks about that in terms of the losses around genocide, but I think you could also say that applies now. These losses of a certain kind of rights to be subjects applies to millions of avoidable COVID deaths that have arisen from vaccine colonialism and government denialism and neglect. And those can't be made up for, Baba says. They can never be made up for, but maybe repeatedly remarking them in a kind of narrative of complaint can be a kind of placeholder for what needs to change or what is changing. I'm not going to do I've got a piece of text that I'd like you to look at. So I'm not going to do another kind of separate discussion of this quote, but I think it's interesting. Baba says, however sincere our spirit of reconstruction and reparation, however earnest our instinct for truth and reconciliation, the spectres of these events that took away the right to narrate, haunt our lives like voids that we can never retrospectively endow with the right to narrate. So these rights cannot be retrospectively regained, made up for in any way. So, you know, quite often in narrative research, there is some sense that by talking about it a lot, by narrating, by bringing stories together or something, in a way you make amends. You know, there's a notion of reparation, perhaps, or something like that. Barbara is quite firm that that is not really going to happen. I just want to end by emphasizing that something that's come out very strongly in many recent debates, for instance, around Black Lives Matter, something that's actually in the Stories Changing Lives chapters a lot too, I think, which is the historicity of social change and how that needs to be addressed within narrative research. Many theorists of social injustice, like Cornel West and Angela Davis, for instance, have pointed out that progressive social change is not limited to what's happened or what's happening recently or what's about to happen. Social change, including that described in and generated by narrative, is a historical process of many moments of interruption, as West calls them, and then efforts to sustain those. And it involves the often under-acknowledged struggles and gains of social movements, at least as much of those of electoral democracy, so that even if we see countries with electoral democracies being taken over by, you know, right populism, that doesn't mean that nothing else is happening. Angela Davis has, of course, been saying this all through her life, I would say. So this historical continuum of struggle takes place across many fields, some of them not immediately obvious. And that's pretty much why I focused on Adichie's and Baba's accounts here of often quite implicit processes of change, just through narrative expansion or through the assertion of the right to narrate. And I haven't really focused on any more general or encompassing theories of narrative change. So I've just put some references here to recent talks from these theorists. And then what I want to end with, and maybe we can spend some time talking about it, is some stories told by one of the participants in the UK study on living with HIV and COVID. And he called himself, I think this is the best pseudonym ever, and he's very proud of it too, so let me just say that, Mr. Oscar Milk, derived from Oscar Wilde and the gay mayor of San Francisco who was murdered, Harvey Milk. So Mr. Oscar Milk told a very long story, of which we see a little bit on the left here, of the removal of his rights to food during the first lockdown in the UK. You know, in the 6th largest economy in the UK, he couldn't get food. He's somebody living with HIV.
Sorry, did you say that which we can see? Because we can't see something right now.
Oh, can you see the slides before?
I haven't seen any slides for a bit.
Okay, let me just do a slide.
I didn't, yeah.
That's kind of strange because it said to me that it was slide sharing. So let me do it again. Sorry about that. I'm just trying to ask the computer to see if you still not see it now. Oh, here we go. Okay, good.
Great, it's happening.
It is. Thanks, Molly. I'll just go to the last slide. Okay, here we go. So Mr. Oscar Milk is talking during the first, just at the end of the first lockdown, I think, in the UK, and he tells a very long story, actually, it's not all of it here, about the difficulties he had in getting food. He's living with HIV and also some other illnesses, and he was meant to be shielding, which meant in the terms of the UK government that they would be throwing their arms around him to protect him. So he was supposed to be getting food from the government and as well as medication and kinds of things, but in fact he was getting nothing. So he describes in extensive detail, actually, his loss of food rights and how this felt to be shut out, really, from citizenship, to be a beggar, to be asking for food in this way, in, as I just said, the 6th largest economy in the world. So this takes up a large portion of the interview, actually, but then quite soon after he finishes storying and restorying this in some depth, he then tells another story about a kind of reconstitution of sociality during COVID around the what was called in the UK the clap for carers moments. These were once a week times when people came out of their houses and clapped to support and appreciate health workers, social carers, supermarket workers, transport workers, and all those people working on the front line during the pandemic. And this is this is kind of a story, you know, you might say that this first story is the single story. Mr. Oscar Meltart tells a very long story about being shut out of food rights. And in the process, certainly asserts a right to narrate this exclusion and a right to be reconsidered as a citizen, I guess. And then he turns to this other story, which is quite different, which partly also relies on a notion of urban alienation, kind of historical story. He says, what does he say? Oh, I thought everyone in central London is so jaded, I didn't expect it to happen. That is, he didn't think that people would get together and clap for carers. Then he describes how people did clap for carers. They all did it, he says, and I was absolutely amazed. All the different people, you know, all of the different colours and nationalities, they were all hanging out the window, banging. So some people were banging on saucepans and things like this. And I was really pleased because I was absolutely convinced that being central London, that whole sense of community is gone. But they all do it, and it's quite impressive. He says, I do get quite a tingle when it happens. So this is a radically different moment when another world, another narrative seems to be possible to Mr. Oscar Meltart. It's just really one moment within the rest of his story. So what I'm interested in here, and I will be asking him about this too, he's already been quite involved with the analysis. What I'm interested in here really is, you know, is this kind of assertion of, this assertion on the left hand here of his rights as a person, his rights as a person really, to have food, to therefore be able to live as a person. Is that a kind of assertion of the kind that Baba is talking about? Because he could have said nothing about this, you know, really. He could have just not talked about it. But he clearly talked about it not only in the research, but to everybody he met. He wasn't shy about talking about this. And then again, on this other side, this new story, is that an extension or a replacement of his previous story? Does it even mean anything? Does this kind of conversion moment of a new sociality really have any social change significance for the person himself, for those around him? People often debated this later. They said these clap for carers moments meant nothing. You know, given that COVID went on to kill hundreds of thousands more in the UK, these moments, and carers in fact got nothing, got no pay rise or anything like this. These moments were just cynical moments. This moment meant something to Mr. Oscar Meltart at the time. So what do you think of that? Do you think that that is indeed an extension of the single story into something else? So I think if we could spend a bit of time talking about that, just in groups again, that would be great. I know we don't have a lot of time. I don't know if you could screenshot it, Molly. Could you do that?
Yeah, I'm doing that.
Oh, great, thank you so much.
No problem. Hold
Okay,
on.
so
Do you want to stop sharing now and I'll put
I
this
will
in the
do,
chat
yeah.
so everybody has it.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank
Hold
you.
on a second.
And I'm gonna again just find some breakout rooms for people. In fact, I think we'll just go back to those breakout rooms just for I don't know, about 5 to 10 minutes, and then come back in again.
We only have 13 more minutes in
5
this.
minutes. But I think that the time that you spend discussing is more important than the time in the feedback. So maybe 7 minutes, something like that. Okay, are we okay, Molly? Can I go to the?
Yeah. It's been loaded into the chat so everybody can Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm going to open the rooms again. So see you again soon.